what proportion of U.S. equity mutual funds in your sample outperform SPY? And by the way, I love that you used a live fund as a comparison. So what proportion of U.S. equity mutual funds beat SPY in your sample at the decade horizon specifically?
I think I've got here the lifetime number, but it's a
Sure.
30-year sample, and it's not going to be greatly different. So it's 30%.
Hmm.
30% of funds beat the SPY, and I'm glad you mentioned that. But I think it's important to compare to a benchmark that, in principle, somebody could have earned.
Hmm.
Anyway, that's why we chose the SPY as the benchmark. By the way, I'll mention here there's another widely recognized study that goes after the same question, and that's the SPIVA scorecard. And I'll just refer people to the paper for the details. But 30% is actually a higher number than what SPIVA reports. And if you're curious why that is, I'll refer interested people to the paper.
Yeah,
I
I did
assume
read that. I
fees.
read that part of the paper with interest because your number is quite a bit higher than
Mhm.
SPIVA.
But Speedball also benchmarks to the index, not to a live fund. Is that right?
I believe that's true, but it's not the main thing. Not the main thing driving it.
Should we talk about it? Because people might be
I
interested.
mean, I guess we could. I mean, I think in some sense the SPIVA people are transparent about it. They focus on funds that outperform and survive. That is, so they take, say, a 20-year period, and they say, okay, during the 20 years, they take the funds that were there at the start of the 20 years, and then they say, did you outperform? Yes or no? Uh, were you there for the whole 20 years? Yes or no? And to be in their number, you have to both outperform and be there for the 20 years. Uh, you might not see this coming, but there's quite a lot of funds that outperformed but were not there for the whole 20 years. So anyway, that's the difference.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure how the U.S. study is done, but in Canada, I know they also mix in commission-based funds into their sample, which have much higher fees to pay for the cost of advice, and that drives down the performance just because the fees are so much higher. So I don't know how they do it in the U.S. report though.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. They have footnotes that detail their methods, but I haven't can't recall all of them.
Yeah, that one's not in a footnote. That one I had to email years ago to ask about their
Mhm.
methodology, and it
Mhm.
was anyway. Yeah, so that could, I don't know if that contributes, but it could make a difference. Obviously, if the fees are a lot higher than your sample.
Yeah, good.
Okay, so back to this paper. How does the average mutual fund perform?
So if we focus on means, averages, in some sense, I've got the same result that the prior papers have, which is basically that on average, mutual funds turn in slightly negative performance. They slightly trail their benchmarks. Um, you know, and this is something that other people have found too. There is some evidence of skill among fund managers, but not quite enough to overcome their fees on average. I've got to, when I compound the returns, I've still got essentially the same punchline about what happens on average. Um, but I've been trying to emphasize, one of the messages is we need to look beyond averages, and there is skewness in the distribution of compound fund returns. It's for the same reasons that there is in individual stocks. It's not nearly as dramatic as it is in individual stocks for the reasons we've been talking about it, but there is skewness in the distribution, and it's enough to matter.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I found so interesting about this paper is that the majority of funds underperform before fees, like gross of fees. That's like, I mean, that's crazy. It's
Yeah.
not. I mean, it's expected based on what we've been talking about, but
Yep.
it's just crazy to think about.
Yep, exactly right. On average, they outperform before fees. But again, the average is not the typical fund. The typical fund underperforms even before deducting fees.
Yeah, that's wild. Now, the other side of that, as we've been talking about, so most funds underperform by number of funds, but are there also some big winners like we see in stock returns?
Yep, exactly. Now it's not as dramatic as in the stock returns. I'm not going to tell you about anybody getting 250 million%. But so we had almost 8,000 funds in the study. So among those, there were about 450 that doubled the SPY over their lifetimes, and there were about 160 that tripled the SPY over their lifetimes. And the SPY is a pretty high hurdle during the 30 years we studied, 1990 to 2020, roughly. So tripling the SPY is, really, really impressive. I mean, there were some fund managers that really delivered. Of course, we still have the question of can you identify them in real time as opposed to looking back.
Yeah, the persistence question. It's a tough one.
Yep.
Well, and can you hold throughout that whole period too, right? Like,
Yeah.
you actually have to capture the entire period returns yourself, and you have to behave well.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
that's an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here because I'm pretty sure you're going to ask me about the $1 trillion number in a minute. Uh, so we can maybe jump to that. In the abstract of the paper, we say mutual fund investors underperformed by $1 trillion compared to the SPY benchmark, which is a big number, a striking number, but it's got a few pieces built into it. So again, we do find, consistent with others, that there's evidence that on average fund managers are skilled, but their fees are bigger than the skill on average. So that's one contributor, fees. There's also we consider opportunity costs. So essentially, if you paid a 1% fee back in 1990, that's 1% less that you had invested as the market had a great 3 decades. So I'm measuring things at the end of the sample. So we're also picking up opportunity costs on fees. But the third thing that you kind of touched on there, it's partly investors' own fault. Return chasing behavior has not helped. It's actually hurt investors. And we touched on this earlier. You can compute buy and hold returns. They're a hypothetical if somebody had done buy and hold. And the SPY is a buy and hold benchmark. So if this is what you mentioned, Mark, the benchmark is the hypothetical person who bought and held the SPY. Now, in actual funds, people are not buy and hold investors. So you can measure the buy and hold returns, which is the geometric mean, or you can measure this dollar weighted return, which takes into account money going in and out, the effects of return chasing. And a significant part, we couldn't find a way to cleanly break it into pieces, but return chasing also contributes to that negative 1 trillion number. So it's a combination of fees, compounding on fees, and investors' own return chasing behavior.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's cool that you're able to get that piece in there. I don't know if I realized. I did not realize that when I read through the paper.
It's kind of subtle that there's all 3 of them are going on in there.
Yeah, makes sense though.
I might throw in here though an editorial comment, because if you see that $1 trillion number, it'd be easy to conclude from that. Well, I'll just stay away from actively managed mutual funds. But again, part of the problem is investors' own behavior. Control this tendency to chase returns. It's not helping you. But the other thing is, in the past, there's this question of how big is active versus passive. What I take away from this is, in the past, we had some combination of too much active money and too high of fees. But active has gotten smaller and fees have gotten lower. So we got to make decisions based on the future, not the past. So with a smaller active segment and lower fees, those past numbers don't have to dominate our thinking about the future. Anyway, I'll just throw that out there.
That is really interesting, because the index share is getting pretty significant, especially in the U.S. market.
Right, and just doing thought experiments. If that index share got up to say 95%, then I have really strong intuition that there would be money to be made in active funds, because if everybody's indexing, why should the prices be efficient? And if the prices aren't efficient, the reasoning.
The Grossman-Stiglitz paradox.
Exactly.
We had Marco Salmon at Harvard on the podcast a while ago, and he has a paper estimating the total active share, not just of funds, but he uses like transaction volume around reconstitution dates, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And his number was 34% or something like that of the U.S. market. So we're still got a ways to go, maybe. I don't know, from 95%. I don't know what the limit is, though.
Yeah, I don't know either. Marco's got a series of interesting papers. We're hosting a conference here. My academic department's hosting a conference here, and one of his papers is on the program. I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Okay, nice. Yeah, he was great on the podcast here. Okay, we talked about mutual fund underperformance. We talked about fees. We talked about skewness. Do you know proportionally, like roughly even, how much of mutual fund underperformance is explained by fees and how much by skewness?
Yes. So the way we sunk our teeth into that, so we've got the finding that the majority of funds underperform the SPY. So we asked ourselves, well, if you artificially added performance to every fund, how much would you have to add to get to the point where half the funds outperform the SPY? And our answer was you have to add 12 basis points per month. So that's the effect of skewness is about 12, or the net effect is about 12 basis points per month. Now fees in our sample average about 9 basis points per month. So what I take away from that is that the skewness effect is actually a little bigger than the fee effect.
Yeah, interesting.
So in terms of what a typical fund does. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so what are the lessons from this research for investors?
I think it's parallel to the individual stock stuff. The central question again, maybe the single biggest question is, should I be a passive diversified investor or should I be an active investor? And so it's the same question here. I think many investors, makes sense for a lot of investors to be indexers. Or be broadly diversified. There's actually a distinction there that we maybe should spend a little time on. You don't have to be in an index to be diversified, and the debate about the Magnificent Seven and their effect on the value-weighted indices is relevant in the background there. So let me rephrase it a little bit. Be broadly diversified versus being active. For many people, it makes sense to be broadly diversified. But if you either value skewness or you think you can find the right fund manager, you deviate from that.
Yep. I just made a video on this that by the time this episode is out, I think my video will have been released. My conclusions were way more extreme than that. I said most people should be indexing, but I did think about it's hard to. My YouTube videos are shorter than this podcast. They're like 10 or 15-minute videos. Mm-hmm. And it's harder to keep people's attention, I think, in those shorter videos. So I don't add as much nuance, but my case for index funds was something like low costs, broad diversification, tax efficient, simple, and theoretically consistent. But you can get all of those things in an actively managed fund. So it's not like, but telling that to, a random person with relatively low financial literacy is not going to help them, I don't think.
Yeah, and I'm not sure your punchline and mine are that much different. I mean, if people did say, well, what do you advise for me? Right. not that I'm giving advice. Most of the time, I think my answer would be broadly diversified, and a low cost index fund can deliver that for you. But some people are skilled, and some managers are skilled, and some people like skewness. And should I tell them they shouldn't like skewness? I mean, that's that's kind of their decision. I just want them to. I just want them to be educated about it.
Yeah, we had I think Vanguard's former CIO on this podcast a while ago, and he talked about how there was some evidence. I can't remember if this was academic published papers or not, or if it was Vanguard evidence, but they had evidence that fund companies were able to identify skilled managers before the fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm at least open-minded to the idea, that, In economic speak, it's comparative advantage. So some people have comparative advantage at running funds, and some people have comparative advantage at identifying those with comparative advantage.
Yeah.
The question we all have to ask ourselves, though, is that me? Do I have the
Yeah,
comparative
yeah.
advantage?
The other interesting question on the size of the active management industry is even if we decided at some point, okay, the passive is too big, it makes sense to go active. You still have to make the decision eventually at some point to go back to passive, which is not an easy decision.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and the best answer might differ at different points in time.
Yeah.
On the
Yeah, we
risk of
talked
being
to
wrong is really
years
high too,
ago.
right?
We had Lubosh Pastor on this podcast, and he talked about his research on that, and we had the same conversation. I left thinking like, well, I still don't know when I would switch back to passive.